President Trump spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin Tuesday. The phone call lasted about 90 minutes, according to the White House. The two leaders both said they agreed to begin negotiations immediately to achieve a fuller ceasefire. They also discussed efforts to strengthen the relationship between the U.S. and Russia. President Trump wrote about the call on Truth Social, saying, quote, "My phone conversation today with President Putin of Russia was a very good and productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure, with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine." Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine more than 3 years ago. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us. So, Ed, what were your takeaways from the readouts of the call, and what happens next?
Well, while both sides called it a successful call and that they plan to talk again, the White House did not get what it was seeking. Russian agreement to join a 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine signed off on about a week ago. Instead, the Russian leader said that he has ordered his military commanders not to target any Ukrainian energy or infrastructure locations. Unclear what the definition of infrastructure is, but by not hitting power plants, nuclear power plants, whatever else that have been targeted in the past, that is at least one step the Russians are taking. He also, the Russian leader, apparently asked that if there is to be a ceasefire, then all foreign military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine be ceased during that time. That's a non-starter for the Ukrainians, obviously, but also many of the European allies that have been involved in assisting Ukraine over the last 3 years, arguing that if all military and intelligence assistance were to stop, it would allow Russia to unfairly reload and prepare for any resumption of hostilities should that come, while Ukraine would just essentially sit there not getting the weapons and the intelligence it's been receiving. But the White House says there are going to be immediate talks in the Middle East to reach an eventual ceasefire and then a final peace agreement. Unclear who exactly is going to those peace talks, where they're being held, what countries would be invited. Either way, here at the White House, at least so far, seen as a modest success because, A, the call happened, they agreed to keep talking, and there was at least that limited ceasefire agreed to.
And I want to also ask about Chief Justice John Roberts. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, the federal judge who temporarily blocked the recent deportations to El Salvador via this wartime law should be impeached. Justice Roberts released a statement saying for more than 2 centuries it's been established impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. How significant is that response?
He has responded in the past to public statements the president has made disparaging federal judges, perhaps most memorably when the president was disparaging an Obama judge, someone who had been appointed by the former president. The Chief Justice stepped in and said, look, we're not red and blue judges. We're not Republican or Democratic judges. We're all trying to interpret and issue rulings impartially and professionally. So it's no surprise to see him speak up again about his long simmering concerns about how public rhetoric is putting the lives of judges and their families and their staff at risk. What's notable is that this statement came just hours after the president had suggested that the chief of the U.S. District Court here in Washington, who'd ruled in the case regarding those 3 flights that went to El Salvador over the weekend, should be impeached. They have a history because he was involved to some extent with the January 6 cases, so the president already doesn't like the guy. But by suggesting he should be impeached, the Chief Justice felt compelled to step in, as the Supreme Court said, in response to inquiries that it had been receiving from reporters. And so the timing is notable because it shows the Chief Justice is clearly paying close attention, is willing to call out someone who's going to have business before the High Court yet again in the coming months and years regarding the policy changes he's making, and reinforcing the concern that he has and judges across the system, federal, state, and local, have about potential violence towards public officials.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you as always.
Trump, who boasted on the campaign that he could end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, spent 2.5 hours on the phone today trying to do just that.
By the time he hung up with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president had agreed to an immediate pause on attacks on energy infrastructure targets, but not to a broader 30-day ceasefire.
Still, the White House called it a first step towards peace. Holly Williams is in Ukraine. Holly?
Good Good evening. After that call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin said tonight that Russia will only agree to a long-term ceasefire if all foreign military aid to Ukraine is stopped.
In a forest just north of Kyiv, we met a team of unpaid volunteers training on air defense systems. Their job is to shoot down deadly Russian drones. With many of this country's men serving on the front line, the majority are women, and they all come from the town of Bucha and the surrounding area. Bucha was the scene of a massacre by Russian forces at the start of Vladimir Putin's invasion. The Russians executed civilians on the street. Olena Akuma is an artist who told us she survived the occupation of Bucha with her 2 children. After 3 years of war, she'd like a ceasefire, but she has conditions.
If Vladimir Putin says, yes, I agree to a ceasefire, but only if the US stops supplying Ukraine with weapons, would that be okay with you?
No, she told us. How can we believe Putin when our head is in his mouth? Since the start of this war, the US has committed over $100 billion to support Ukraine. This country's trying to become more self-reliant. Ukraine says it now makes 30% of its own weapons.
We're making it for survival of the country.
Vladislav Belbas owns a Ukrainian weapons company, but told us without a continued supply of American arms, Russia will overrun his country.
So actually, they feel the power to invade other countries.
So you're saying if Russia succeeds here in Ukraine, it will give it the confidence to invade other countries and start more wars?
Of course.
And Holly, as I'm watching all this, I can't help but wonder, is Vladimir Putin serious?
Well, look, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, agreeing to halt strikes on energy infrastructure may help it look like he's doing something and being responsive to President Trump's desire to end the war, but without actually stopping the war. And to that point, soon after the call ended, air raid sirens sounded around Ukraine tonight.
And Holly, Putin has put a condition on ending the war completely on a complete cessation of foreign military and intelligence assistance. Is that just a delaying tactic during negotiations?
Well, John, it might be. But interestingly, after that contentious meeting between President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House last month, the US actually did briefly suspend deliveries of military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. So now the question is whether Trump would be willing to do that long term as part of a negotiation with